of Kenya, Excellencies, heads of state, representatives of heads of state, governors of the bank, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, kindly permit me to stand on already established protocols. Once again, Karibu. Wow, that's the first time Karibu has been met with silence, so I'm going to say that once again. Karibu. Now that's a little bit more enthusiastic. I think we're getting into it. Thank you very much, President Ruto, for those really, truly inspiring and passionate words. Very, very heartfelt. Thank you very much. Welcome to this presidential dialogue on Africa's transformation, the African Development Bank Group, and the reform of the global financial architecture here at the annual meetings of the Board of Governors of the African Development Bank, holding at the KICC, Kenyatta International Conference Center, in the beautiful, and I must say green, capital city of Nairobi. My name is Victor Olado. Yes, you can clap for Nairobi and certainly for Kenya. Kenya is green and has had a long history of being so. My name is Victor Olado, and it really is an honor to moderate the two presidential dialogues that are ahead of us this morning. Our conversations will revolve around what must be done in a fast-changing, dynamic global environment to kickstart and transform Africa's economies, as well as ensuring that they do remain sustainable. But first, permit me to invite to the podium a global leader who has a reputation, actually two reputations. One for not believing in the word impossible, and two, for being dubbed Africa's optimist-in-chief, a very well-deserved tag. Not because he is unaware of the continent's many challenges, but because he strongly believes that under any circumstances, change is possible. Please join me in welcoming to the podium once again the President of the African Development Bank Group, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, as he comes forward to provide opening remarks.
Your Excellencies, heads of state and government, their governors, I wish to thank you immensely for attending these 2024 annual meetings, and in particular for being here for this particular session, which is a debate or conversation with you heads of state and government about the issues of the transformation or the reforms of the global financial architecture, the African Development Bank, and of course, Africa's transformation. This is one topic that I know is close to your heart, as you all have been advocating for the reform of global financial architecture, the reforms of the United Nations, including the United Nations Security Council, and we just heard from His Excellency President Ruto all about that. And why is that being done, or why is that necessary? That's to ensure that Africa's voice is heard, that Africa's priorities are in fact prioritized, that Africa's financial needs are appropriately considered, that there is equity, fairness, and justice in dealing with the most pressing challenge of our time, climate change. Clearly, the global financial architecture has a great role to play in mobilizing resources for development. Yet, it is not delivering enough for Africa in 5 ways. First, it is under-delivering on climate finance for Africa. Today, while Africa's climate finance needs are in the order of $277 billion annually, the global financial architecture delivers only $30 billion for Africa, a continent that contributes the least to climate change and which suffers disproportionately from its negative effects, as we have seen in several countries. Second, the global financial system is not delivering financing at scale needed for accelerated development to meet the SDGs. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has noted that the financing need now has moved from $2.5 trillion to $4 trillion annually. Africa alone will need $1.3 trillion. With SDGs, of course, due to lack of adequate financing, Africa will not be able to meet SDGs by 2030 under the current trajectory. Third, the COVID-19 pandemic showed the huge divergences in financing capacities to deal with global pandemics and its effects between developed countries and developing countries. While developed countries provided over $19 trillion to support their economies during this crisis, pandemic, equivalent to roughly 18% of the global GDP, African countries provided only $83 billion or 3% of their GDP. No wonder there is economic divergences between Africa and developed countries and even emerging market economies, because we hear something about COVID, that people have long COVID. But now also in terms of fiscal space for African countries, it's a long COVID in terms of fiscal space because it takes a long time to be able to recover from such pandemics like that. Fourth, the global contingent financing facilities have not been fair and equitable. Take the case of the special drawing rights, as President Ruto has mentioned. Out of the $650 billion of Asia allocation, Africa got $33 billion, which is roughly 4.5%. In other words, those that needed it the most got the least. However, I want to really thank the IMF. I want to thank my sister, Kristalina Georgieva, and all our team at IMF, and of course the IMF board, for recently approving the use of SDRs as hybrid capital, which of course multilateral development banks like us can leverage 3 to 4 times and deliver greater impact based on the model that the African Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank have developed. We're very grateful for that support. I also like to commend the IMF for providing a third seat for Africa at the board of IMF, as the chairman person of the African Union Commission mentioned the importance of having more space around the table for Africa, and we're grateful for that as well. The admission of African Union to G20 is also a commendable development, long overdue. Fifth, the global financial architecture is failing in dealing with the high rising debt burdens of African countries. While the G20 Common Framework is working to address these challenges, and we support it, to achieve equal and comparative treatment between official creditors, private creditors, and commercial lenders, the process, however, is taking way too long. Unfortunately, we shouldn't forget that Africa went through things like that in the 90s. The Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, also the Highly Indebted Poor Country Initiative, that just dragged on, and unfortunately, we had a lost decade because of that. There's therefore a need for speedier, comprehensive resolution of debt burdens of countries. It's hard to run up a hill with a backpack of sand behind one's back. So while globally the Debt Service Suspension Initiative helped to defer due debt service payments, it only postponed it. It did not solve the problem. There is need for more timely, comprehensive debt treatment, debt restructuring, and debt resolution for African countries. And finally, Your Excellencies, the rules of global taxation, as President Ruto rightly mentioned, need to be modified to ensure that they are serving developing countries. Cooperation across jurisdictional tax rules is needed to avoid Africa losing taxes to multinational corporations that do illicit capital flows. And sometimes I hear a lot about illicit capital flows. It's not just African countries. In fact, quite a lot of multinational corporations have more lawyers, they have more accountants, they have more people than the whole country has. And therefore, we have to make sure that the whole issue of profits, tax avoidance, and profit-based shifting is addressed. In my view, if you do business in Africa, you should pay taxes in Africa. Your Excellencies, we look forward to hearing your views and perspectives, especially what the African Development Bank and all of us can do in the reforms of the global financial architecture. I'm particularly delighted that my dear brother and friend and colleague, His Excellency Dr. Mohamed Al-Jazal, President and Chairman of the Islamic Development Bank Group, is here with us today at our annual meetings, and he will also be sharing with you some thoughts ahead of your conversation. Once again, thank you, Your Excellencies, for your participation. It's a great honor for us to have you. Thank you very much.
Just as Dr. Adeshina mentioned a few moments ago, we'd like to use this opportunity to welcome to the podium a friend of Africa and a friend of the African Development Bank, His Excellency Dr. Mohamed Al-Jazal, President of the Islamic Development Bank, to give his keynote address.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Your Excellency, President William Ruto, the President of the Republic of Kenya. Your Excellencies, Heads of State, Your Excellency, my dear brother and friend, Dr. Adesina, President of the African Development Bank Group, the honorable heads of international and regional institutions, honorable ministers, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed an honor to be part of this special gathering to celebrate the African Development Bank Group's 60 years of remarkable contributions to Africa's development journey. I am delighted to address such a distinguished audience today to share my thoughts on Africa's transformation, the African Development Bank Group, and the reform of the global financial architecture. Let me also take this opportunity to highlight the exceptional value we at the Islamic Development Bank place on our strategic partnership with the African Development Bank Group. It is a commitment to a shared dream of transforming the African continent and helping it deliver on its hopes and aspirations. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Africa, a continent full of promise and endowed with abundant resources. Africa, a continent that holds the dreams and aspirations of hundreds of millions of its people. Africa, a continent full of potential, yet grappling with critical challenges on its road to structural transformation. Since the turn of the century, many African countries have exhibited strong economic growth. A significant portion of this growth is the result of better macroeconomic management, higher investment and trade, larger regional markets, and to a lesser extent, some degree of structural transformation. Despite this progress, the core components of human development, including income levels and formal employment, remain low and vulnerable to shocks. This leads me to the key question that the region and its governments need to tackle in the coming years. What will it take to ensure that this higher growth is sustainable and inclusive? To foster and sustain development gains, economic growth alone is insufficient. African countries need to deepen their structural transformation to ensure a prosperous and secure future for all Africans. The priority will be on transforming natural resource-driven economies into knowledge-driven ones, while taking advantage of the region's demographic dividend. Reforms ought to focus on fostering a more conducive business environment to enhance competitiveness and encourage initiatives that take advantage of regional growth opportunities. In this regard, the African Continental Free Trade Area offers a huge potential for building regional supply chains, developing intra-African production networks in manufactured goods, and enhancing competitiveness. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Africa is on the ascent, and I am optimistic about its development prospects. However, recent estimates suggest that Africa will require an additional $200 billion annually to achieve the SDGs by 2030. Moreover, it is becoming increasingly evident that the current global financial system will not be able to provide the necessary support to achieve the ambitious transformative agenda of Africa. It is thus not surprising that there are calls for a rethink of this framework to make it more efficient and just, giving a greater voice to the global South. Additionally, significant resources are being diverted to debt servicing at the expense of critical investments in health and education. This situation clearly demands urgent reform. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, over the past 5 decades, the Islamic Development Bank Group has remained steadfast in its commitment to Africa's socio-economic development. By the end of 2023, our financing to Africa totaled approximately $74 billion, including $45 billion specifically dedicated to enhancing trade. Our efforts have been significantly strengthened through long-standing cooperation with development partners, including the African Development Bank. Between 2017 and 2023, we achieved a record co-financing volume of $2.9 billion with the African Development Bank, enabling us to co-finance 22 operations across diverse sectors, and some of them have been mentioned by my brother, Mr. Adesina. I am pleased to announce that during the Islamic Development Bank's Golden Jubilee celebrations in Riyadh last month, we further enhanced our partnership with the African Development Bank by expanding its scope and setting a higher co-financing target over the next 5 years. In this quest, where collaboration is paramount for success, the role of the Arab Coordination Group, or the ACG, in fostering development and progress across the African continent cannot be underestimated. To this end, the ACG has been a long-standing supporter of African countries and has cumulatively invested over $220 billion in the region to date. Bolstering its support for African partner countries, in November 2023, the ACG pledged a $50 billion financing envelope over the next 7 years to help build resilient infrastructure and inclusive societies in the African continent. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we share common dreams for Africa, a continent free of poverty where no one is left behind, a continent of hope and prosperity driven by innovation and entrepreneurship, a continent providing meaningful employment opportunities for its youth. We remain steadfast in our commitment to work with our development partners to rekindle hope, to realize Africa's dreams of transformation, especially when we recall the wise words of our host, His Excellency President Ruto, and I hope he doesn't mind me quoting him, who said recently, only very recently, that Africa is neither facing east or west, but is facing forward. I wish you all successful deliberations throughout the remainder of this dialogue. I look forward to positive impact these discussions will have on shaping our strategies and actions to mobilize affordable financing for Africa's inclusive growth and structural transformation. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Many thanks, Dr. Al-Jazeer, for your keynote address and for framing many of the issues which will surround much of the presidential dialogues that have been convened this afternoon, or this morning and afternoon. At this point, I would like to invite members of the first presidential dialogue panel to take their seats on the platform. So, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, please welcome His Excellency Mr. Musa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of the African Union Commission. Her Excellency Mrs. Sarah Kugon Gelwa Amadila, Prime Minister of the Republic of Namibia, representing His Excellency Mr. Nangolo Mbumba, President of the Republic of Namibia. His Excellency Mr. Mohamed Yunus El Menfi, President of the Presidential Council of the State of Libya. His Excellency Mr. Paul Kagame, President of the Republic of Rwanda. And last but certainly not the least, His Excellency Dr. William Samoei Ruto, President of the Republic of Kenya. Thank you, Excellencies, for joining us on this panel. Just a few rules here. One, because we are running behind time by probably almost 50 minutes. Each one of you will have about 3 minutes to respond to each of the questions that are posed to you. But I'd like to kickstart this dialogue, first of all, with a question for President Ruto. Just last week, you took America by storm. You were the talk of the town for a considerable amount of time in Atlanta and in Washington, D.C., the first African leader to go on a state visit to Washington, D.C. in 50 years. From all indications, a very, very successful mission, and we say congratulations to you and to Kenya. Now, for quite a while, you've been a very vocal advocate for reforming the global financial architecture, and we've heard much from you today. You've pretty much given us a tour de force of what Africa needs and what Africa needs to do. Now, considering that change is usually slow and not as quick as we anticipate it or want it to be, in terms of priorities in the short term, what do you think Africa should focus on, and what should be the major priorities moving forward?
Thank you very much. And again, let me take this opportunity to welcome all of us to Nairobi and Kenya. It is said that half the solution to a problem is identifying that there exists a problem. For a very long time, many people did not admit that there was something fundamentally wrong with the international financial architecture. In fact, initially, when voices were raised, they were dismissed. But I want to say today we are very proud, those of us, especially from this continent, who raised our voices, that today the conversation in the world is no longer whether we have a fit-for-purpose international financial architecture. Everybody admits that there is something fundamentally wrong with it. The issue in conversation now is where, how do we reform it? So the issue of reform is settled. It must be done. And I think it begins with, once we understand the problem, then it begins with where do we start? I think what we are saying is we need a financial architecture that has the following characteristics. Number one, long-term financing. 40 years, grace period, 10 years, or something in that order. Number two, low interest rates, concessional financing, including, where possible, grants. Number three, we also need financing at scale. The quantum is very important. And then number four, we also need financing that is agile, that is flexible, especially that responds, that is climate sensitive, so that if there are shocks, that financial architecture must be responsive, because climate change is the new normal. Switching from drought to floods progressively is becoming what it is. In Kenya, we had drought a year ago that decimated 2.5 million heads of livestock. This year, we're in floods that has taken the lives of 200 Kenyans. So this is the new reality. So the financial architecture that must be in place must respond to this climate reality that we have. And finally, is to be sensitive to sustainability. So our priority is to sort out the financial architecture. That's number one. Number two, our priority is to make sure that this continent, with its tremendous potential, we move it from potential to opportunity, from opportunity to investment. And finally, as I have said, even as we try to do something outside, we must also do something inside. That is why we are also looking at our own systems, our own governance, our own instruments. And that's why we are discussing, even internally, reform of the African Union, so that we are aligned as we reform the international financial architecture, as we reform the investment space to create opportunity for our assets. We must also reform our own institutions so that we align them and repurpose them to be in line with our aspirations and the outcomes we are looking for.
Thank you very much, President Ruto. In other words, reform is a two-way street. It's not just one way. But allow me to follow up very quickly. As we all know, Kenya and a number of other countries have been buffeted very devastatingly by extreme weather conditions, unpredictable weather conditions. And I think the projections for Kenya and other countries in the region are that over the next 7 years, we're still likely to see the same kind of weather patterns that we've seen this year. That being the case, and again, following a two-way reform process, what is it that African countries should be doing right now to mitigate the effects of climate change?
It is true that predictions are that Kenya and our region is going to have above normal rains for the next 7 years. That's a prediction. It is both positive and negative. And that is why, working with institutions like the Africa Development Bank, we are developing resilience instruments. It is the reason why we are having a conversation with the Africa Development Bank on our water infrastructure. How do we take care of this excess water? And how do we turn this excess water into an asset for making sure that we use it for our food security, we use it for the positive elements. So we must align our programs, our strategies with the reality of the moment and with the predicted reality of the future. So that is the alignment that we must do.
Thank you very much, President Ruto. I'm going to come to President Kagame next on a number of issues, particularly with regards to the global financial architecture, as well as the issue of reforms. Both yourself and President Ruto have been aligned. That being the case, what reforms do you really think should pave the way for giving Africa the resources that it needs to finance its own transformation and inclusive growth, even in the face of devastating climate change? What are the most critical reforms that you see and anticipate are needed?
Thank you. Let me quickly, first of all, and more importantly, thank our hosts, President Ruto, His Excellency, and also the President of the Africa Development Bank Group for inviting us here. Now, quickly to the point, we are talking about the architecture of, international financial architecture. Therefore, in mind, we have the architects. So what did the architect have in mind when they provided us with the architecture we have to deal with? They must have had their own interests. They must have framed things the way they wanted to benefit themselves, or maybe we can assume that they wanted to benefit the whole world. Now, we are here discussing the situation as it is, where we find there are enormous resources in this world, but inequitably distributed. So Africa has to look at itself and look at the whole world as it's set up. And we know in this world, people, countries, work for interests, their own interests. Africa's interests and the countries of our continent interests must be taken care of, beginning with ourselves. So, and we talk about speaking with one voice many times. It has to be one voice. It has also to be loud and clear and effective. For that to happen, we think about working together. We think about representation. And representation is not also just numbers. It's being able to speak out loudly and representing ourselves rather than having other people represent us. So it starts from what has been talked about, that is very important, when it was in the speech of His Excellency President Ruto and His Excellency Musa Faki. Therefore, the reforms we are talking about is how do we disrupt, if you will, the current architecture as we have it, so that it includes significantly and visibly the interests of our continent. Our continent, whether it is human resources or natural resources or any resources we are thinking about, how can anyone interested in the well-being of the people of this world sideline our continent? In actual fact, if you look at the facts as they are, in a few decades, the only place in this world that will be having a growing middle class is Africa, the only one. So it is even in the interests of the rest of the world that has marginalized Africa to contribute to the well-being of our continent, because the growth of Africa, based on this middle class, feeds into the growth of the rest of the world. So they should even be accepting some of these proposals in self-interest, because Africa grows, the whole world grows. But Africa cannot wait to be handed this opportunity by anybody else. We therefore must be on the front line, really fighting for this right, and therefore for ourselves, but also which contributes to the well-being of the rest of the world.
President Kagame, I want to be a little bit provocative here. I've been coming to Kenya for probably 30 years, and there are places that I used to know that I no longer recognize. Why? Because the city's architects have changed the landscape. Now, most of the Bretton Woods institutions were created 60 to 80 years ago, at a different time from the one that we live in. So, if we're going to talk about reform, it's not just the access to resources. It's looking at those institutions that were created back then and asking the question, are they still relevant to the needs of today? What is your thought about redesigning a lot of these institutions to make them fit for purpose?
Well, absolutely. It's a no-brainer that what worked 50 years ago or designed 50 years ago, things have changed, and therefore a rethink of a new design that fits the purpose must be into play. There's no question about it. But here what we are talking about is not simply an argument of whether, this is fit for purpose or this. I think everybody understands that point. But there are philosophies, if you will, or interests or that operate behind that. For us in Africa, we are hard-pressed to see that there is a change of these and in the design of these institutions. But maybe the way the institutions are set up, benefiting some parts of the world, those in those parts of the world are not interested in having the change happen, because it gives them control, it gives them say over other people's resources even. So it's not that people don't understand. Especially for Africa, we understand it better because of how we are affected. But the other parts of the world that have the power and control, it's also not because they don't understand, but it is because that it serves them very well, benefits them that they are not interested or they are slow in allowing change to happen. So it's not a very complicated thing to understand. Everybody understands that. What is complicated is to reach this understanding and compromise that we don't lose anything by having everybody benefit as we should benefit, all of us. That's where the issue lies. And therefore, the reforms are based on this thinking. We are only looking for the pathways to having the reforms implemented that provide us with less costs than having to fight so much over what is obvious that actually benefits all of us, as I say.
Thank you very much, President Kagame. I'm going to come next to President Al-Menfi. Let me bring it closer home. Obviously, your country has had quite a number of challenges economically in recent times. What areas do you think that the African Development Bank can support Libya in the best to help you reach that last mile of reaching economic transformation in your country?
شكرا جزيلا. أنا أعطي فرصة حتى للترجمة إذا كان في I will talk in Arabic.
And President El-Melfi, if you could just move your microphone a little bit closer to you.
في البداية أحب أن أشكر فخامة الرئيس على الضيافة وحسن الاستقبال والشعب الكيني، وأيضا على مجهوده الكبير الذي يقوم به في هذا التحول الذي أعتبره هو نقلة مهمة جدا في التحول المالي وكيفية معالجة المؤسسات المالية في أفريقيا. والحقيقة أيضا أريد أن أؤكد على نقطة أخرى، وهو أن أحيانا في بعض الدول الأفريقية الحاجة تكون للعناصر الفنية وللخبرات وليس المالية، وهذا ما يسمى بالتوأمة وما يسمى بالتكامل المالي داخل أفريقيا، والذي نرجو أن يكون هو الطموح الذي نريد أن نصل عليه. كل المؤسسات المالية أسست في فترة كانت فيها الدول الأفريقية قابعة تحت الاستعمار، وبالتالي أسست وفق آليات معينة لا تخدم أفريقيا، لكن أفريقيا اليوم هي أفريقيا أكثر تطوراً، أفريقيا فيها العديد من الثروات من الموارد، وبالتالي قدرة أفريقيا اليوم على البناء والتنمية تختلف عن أي وقت ماضي. والحقيقة نحن نريد أن نؤكد على أن الدور الذي قامت به ليبيا في فترات زمنية في عدة دول أفريقية، مستعدة ليبيا اليوم أنها تدعم هذا الاستثمار الذي قامت به في دول أفريقية. يحتاج فقط إلى بعض الترتيبات المالية والضمانات المالية مع بعضنا كأفارقة. فليبيا مثال، ربما تكون ليبيا في استقرارها السياسي هي العنصر الذي سيساعد هذه المؤسسات المالية، وخصوصا أننا نتحدث الآن على 3 مؤسسات مالية مهمة جدا، والحديث فيها عن البنك الأفريقي للتنمية وكذلك البنك الأفريقي للاستثمار الذي يوجد الآن في طرابلس، ونحن بصدد يعني استكمال كل الإجراءات التنفيذية الخاصة به، وسيكون داعم في العديد من الدول الأفريقية، وربما هو سيكون إضافة حقيقية للاستقرار المالي في أفريقيا. نحن نريد أن يكون هناك أيضا تبادل ما بين، سواء كان بين الدول أو على مستوى الاتحاد الأفريقي داخل ليبيا في الاستيراد والتصدير، وهذا تحدث عليه فخامة الرئيس، والنسب اللي تحدثوا عليها سواء كان التبادل داخل أوروبا أو آسيا. نحن في أفريقيا محتاجين أن يكون عندنا هذا الأمر. فليبيا هي بحاجة إلى تعاون أفريقي، لأن ليبيا هي دائما تنظر إلى بعدها الأفريقي. ليبيا تريد أن تستكمل كل ما بدأ تجاه أفريقيا، لأننا نحن نؤمن بأن قوة ليبيا هي من قوة أفريقيا، وقوة أفريقيا من قوة ليبيا، وبالتالي استثماراتنا عندما تتجه إلى الجنوب